Dr. Altaf Saab for extending this invitation to me. And I have been asked to speak on Iqbal's concept of the divine. And I was asked by my dear student and friend, Dr. Asrar, whether I would like to speak in English or in Urdu. Although I can sense that most of the audience, members of the audience here, are more attuned to Urdu. But since I'm going to talk about Iqbal's Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, which is a book written in English, so I told him that it would be much better if I stick to English. And because I'm going to use philosophical concepts and philosophical ideas which are very easily accessible in English, so English would be my medium of choice. Now, as you can very well understand that this is a philosophical problem, and I'm dealing with an issue which is through and through a problem of philosophy of religion. So I will not be surprised if some of you find this difficult to grasp, but there is nothing that I can do about it, because I will try to make it accessible, but there is a limit to that. Beyond a limit I can't go. So what I will say here will be engaging very intellectually, but it will also require some kind of understanding of philosophy, especially philosophy of religion. And as I said, that I have tried to use simple language in this paper, but there are things that, as I said, that I cannot oversimplify, because oversimplifying always leads to some form of distortion. So that I have tried to avoid. So let me begin. I begin with what I call the dilemma of the believing Muslim, or of a reflective believer. He or she may belong to any religious tradition. And this is with special reference to what in philosophy of religion is called divine hiddenness, because God is not, we cannot see God, we cannot experience God directly. We can experience God indirectly, but in philosophy of religion, this problem is called the problem of divine hiddenness. And if you look at the Quran, you will find that there are many instances where this problem somehow is alluded to, or for example, at one point the people of Musa, to whom he was sent, they said that we will not believe in you, lan nu'mina laka hatta nara Allah jaharatan. We will not believe in you until we see God with our own eyes. So what was that they demanded? They said that we want to see God with our own eyes, only then we can believe. And through the study of Quran, we also know that the Prophet ﷺ was repeatedly asked by people that show us some sign, some miracle. By sign they meant some kind of miracle that would break the natural laws, which would be some kind of supernatural intervention in the natural scheme. But all those requests were declined. There were reasons for that, which I don't have time to go into, but I'm just trying to point out to this problem that even when prophets lived among people, God never showed himself. And this is a thing that all of us have to understand, that as humans, God will remain hidden from the eye, from the senses. It is only through some kind of effort that humans are expected to make that they can have some knowledge of God, perhaps. God rarely, if at all, shows any miracles. He rather insists that people believe in him by reflecting over themselves and nature, and by heeding the call of his messengers. Yet no one should deny the epistemic distance between God and us. There is what in philosophy we call the epistemic distance between God and us. The question is, can we know God? If yes, how? I'm reminded of a story in one of the Masnavis of Fariduddin Attar, the great Persian poet. He says that there was a majzub. His name was Mashuki Tusi. He refers to some majzubs like Mashuki Tusi and many others in his Masnavis. So Mashuki Tusi once goes into the market of perfume sellers, and the market is filled with perfume, and perfume sellers are they are selling their products. He goes to a perfume seller and picks up a bottle of exquisite perfume, and there is a donkey standing there, and he goes and he takes this bottle and he rubs the bottle against the tail of the donkey. And people around him say, "What are you doing? What have you done this? Why have you done this?" And he says that, "I just wanted to illustrate a point, and the point is that people know of God only in as much as this donkey knows of this perfume." And then he leaves the place. This is the basic unknowability of God, perhaps, which poses a huge challenge to the believer. And yet something has to be said about God. And people have said something about God. The German poet Novalis said about Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, that he was a God-intoxicated philosopher. We might say the same thing about Iqbal, that Iqbal was a God-intoxicated philosopher. I want to make a few submissions at the outset. I will be talking mainly with reference to Iqbal's Reconstruction, not much of his poetry, although I will be quoting some verses here and there. And as we know that critics have debated the relation between his poetry, which is in Persian and Urdu, and his philosophy, which is in English prose. Some see two Iqbals, not one, a poet and a philosopher, not always reconcilable. A poet and a philosopher, not always reconcilable. It is true that the demands of the two are different. A philosopher needs to be systematic, coherent, and rational. A poet needs something else, feeling, imagination that goes beyond reason. A poet is generally not offering a system of thought. A poet need not be a systematic thinker. Although there are important differences between Iqbal as a poet and Iqbal as a philosopher, but I don't think that there are two currents going into two different directions. He is usually called a poet-philosopher. Mustansir Mir, a well-known critic and writer, his description of his poetry is poetically mediated thought. He calls Iqbal's poetry poetically mediated thought. And some have also used the description philosophically reflective verse for Iqbal. As I said, that a great poet hardly needs to be a systematic thinker. In fact, one might as well add that there is a tension between systematic thought and artistic creativity. As a lover of Iqbal, I have no hesitation in admitting that he was a man of many shades, trying to assimilate and pull at many strands into some kind of synthesis. His poems register his protests against the inner unease brought to him by philosophy. Iqbal is one of those poets who talk a lot about himself. And in his Urdu poetry, in his Persian poetry, I think in Payam-e-Mashriq, he says at one place that Gurez akhir ze akle zu funun kard, dil khud kam ra az ishq khun kard, ze Iqbal falak paima chipursi, hakim-e nuktadane ma junun kard. Meaning that, what do you ask about this Iqbal who traverses the skies? Our philosopher has embraced madness. That dil khud kam ra az ishq khun kard. He has slit his heart with love. So what do you ask of Iqbal who has embraced madness? And though he was a philosopher, deeply immersed in philosophy, but he also felt the burden of philosophy on his head, on his self, and therefore he used to say here and there, he has said that, oh, what has happened, this hikmato falsafah kardas giran khiz mara pir man asaram in bar giran pak andaz. This is referred to Rumi, that philosophy and wisdom, they weigh me down. Oh Rumi, kindly help me shed off this burden of philosophy. Okay, and this is a very famous verse which is addressed to the Prophet, where he says, Tu hai Maula Yasrab aab meri chara sazi kar, meri danish hai afrangi, mera iman hai zunnari. Some people have suggested that such verses where he regrets his being crushed under the burden of philosophy reflect Iqbal's mature thought. But this is not correct. Iqbal simultaneously wrote poetry and philosophy. His Reconstruction is among his later works, and it is not true at all to say that he abandoned his philosophy in his later years. The truth is that he held on the both strands at the same time, keenly aware of what discursive thought can achieve and what it cannot. Javednama is one of his later and mature works, and towards the end of Javednama there is a passage called Khitab Javed, where he addresses his son. And in this short passage, Iqbal is talking about what his contribution, in his own opinion, is. He says, Man batab-e asr khud guftam do harf, karda am bahrain ra andar do zarf, harf-e picha pich wa harf-e nish dar, ta kunam aklo dile mardan shikar. That is, I have written two types of things according to the taste of the times, according to the need of the times. One he calls, and he says, the karda am bahrain ra andar do zarf. It is as if I have put together two oceans in one container, in one vessel. Harfe picha peach wa harfe nishdar. One he calls harfe picha peach, twisted, and turned and full of twists. That is philosophy. Philosophy is always full of twists and turns. And harfe nishdar, and another word which stings. Okay? Ta kunam aklo dile mardan shikar. So that I hunt both the mind and the heart of people. So if I am writing philosophy, my target is the minds of people. If I am writing poetry, my target is the hearts of people. Harf tehdare ba andaze farang. So my philosophy is layered, tehdar. It is layered ba andaze farang, and it is written in the mode, in the manner of the Westerners. Nalaye mastanai azntari chang. And then there is poetry which is like a song. And asli in as zikr wa asli an fikr. One comes from zikr, another comes from fikr. Tu ibada warise in fikr zikr. And then he prays that my son Javed, he should inherit both these traditions of zikr and fikr from me. These lines clearly show that Iqbal had no regrets that he wrote philosophy. Both poetry and philosophy sprang from the same Iqbal, sometimes complementing each other and sometimes sitting together uneasily. This is something that we should not forget. There is a charge against Iqbal, mainly brought by some secularists, that he employs the techniques of philosophy for apologetic purposes, without displaying anything of the critical spirit of a true philosopher. That he does not present his arguments with sufficient critical scrutiny, and he is often carried away by the views of others like Hegel, MacTaggart, Nietzsche, Bergson, and others. We'll not go and tackle these charges here because we don't have time. Just to tell you that this is the background and how Iqbal is seen. Is Iqbal an Islamic philosopher, or someone who is both a Muslim and a philosopher but not an Islamic philosopher? What is the difference between a writer who is both a Muslim and a philosopher but not an Islamic philosopher? An example that comes to my mind is Kierkegaard's description of Descartes, who said that Descartes was both a Christian and a philosopher but not a Christian philosopher. This would be the position of some orthodox people, orthodox ulama on Iqbal, and there are many scholars, including his friend Sulaiman Nadwi, who, although was very close to him, but he did not agree with many things that he had to say about his philosophy, in his philosophy. What these scholars do is that they take the traditional understanding of the Quran as a criterion and find Iqbal's thought problematic on that premise. Iqbal's concept of divinity, at some places at least, can seem scandalous to the orthodox. A Burmese writer wrote a book on Iqbal's concept of God, Salman Rashid. And he has many things to say against Iqbal's approach and his conclusions. And he says that he assimilates a lot of material from different sources, but ultimately he is not able to present the idea of God as a Muslim philosopher is expected to do. Anyway, we'll leave those criticisms there and move on. To those who think there is no scope for philosophical discussion on God because what the Quran tells us is the final thing, we have a few things to say. This is one thing that you will come across very often, especially in religious circles, that is there any scope for talk of God if we have the book of God with us and the book of God is plain and clear? Is there any scope left for thinking about God? Because this can be a very tricky thing, it can be a very dangerous business, risky to say the least. What this position obscures is an oft overlooked fact that there is nothing simple about any great text, let alone God's revelation. What plagues the Muslim mind is the notion that we just need right action. Thought has been taught for us by our ancestors. It is true that the first sentence of Iqbal's Reconstruction is that Quran is the book that emphasizes action rather than idea. But Iqbal's entire philosophical project shows that how important thought was for him. Every age needs to think afresh, and as Iqbal would say, move ahead in new directions without snapping its ties with the past. Aqli Jumud was one of the things that Iqbal fought against all his life. From a hermeneutical point of view, there is no such thing as an immediate, non-interpretative, pure meaning available to human consciousness. I repeat, from a hermeneutical point of view, there is no such thing as an immediate, non-interpretative, pure meaning available to human consciousness, including that of divine scripture. Quite often, our pre-critical common sense colors our thinking so much that we assume God is directly speaking to us, while there are layers and layers of complexity we need to reckon with in the very act of reading. It is important to engage with the notion of or the concept of divine because we cannot evade the questions that stare us into our face today as never before. Talk about God in some sense is unavoidable. Although it is to attempt to formulate what we know must escape formulation, but for any serious-minded individual, thinking on fundamental problems is unavoidable. How is it possible that you will reflect over everything but not think about your Creator and your relationship with Him? Reflection on God is part of the Quranic hermeneutics itself. When we read the Quran, we necessarily ask, what kind of deity are we worshipping? Add to the fact that our younger generations have many suppressed doubts and questions which remain unaddressed. They gradually grow within their minds and lead to many problems. We have people reading Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and other new atheists and getting carried away. They have no idea of how the talk about God has remained a cornerstone of traditional knowledge. To talk about God should not be seen as an anathema. Iqbal is one among such great minds to have done that. In a verse which Altaf Sahab just quoted, Dardashte Janoone Man Jibreen Zaboon Sede Yazda Bakamad Awar E Himmat Mardana. What exactly does it mean? He says that Jibreel is too weak, too small a prey in the arena, in my hunting ground. Yazda bakamand avar. He says that throw your lasso and bring down God himself. Only Iqbal could have said this. Yazda bakamand avar a himmat-e mardana. O manly valor, throw your lasso to capture God himself. If this sounds too ambitious, downright audacious, it is so. It is audacious. Human mind, it is well said, runs up against its limits when thinking about an infinite God. And yet, look at Iqbal's audacity. He wants to throw his lasso to catch God himself. While it is true that Iqbal, the foremost poet philosopher of modern times, is the foremost poet philosopher of modern times, it is also true that his legacy is not uncontested even within the Muslim world. So, our purpose is not to present his understanding as final, but see how he engages with such important questions and what we can learn from him. Iqbal is trying to provide a rational basis to religion, arguing that God, ego, immortality can be matters of philosophical demonstration. And I'm reminded of R.A. Nicholson, who said in the introduction to Secrets of the Self that Iqbal does not treat philosophy as a handmaid of philosophy, as a handmaid of religion. Iqbal can help us in this age. In fact, the challenge is to avoid conceptual idolatry. This is one point that I will take up later on, how Iqbal can help us do that. But let us first be clear about what we are trying to come to terms with. As I said, that talk about God is not a simple matter. It's very complex. Paul Tillich, the famous German theologian of the 20th century, he famously said that God is so different from anything we know or can know that we can't even say that he exists. Even to say that God exists is somehow to be qualified. In what sense does he exist? Because although he is, but his being is not the same as ours. He is not a being among others. Nothing in human experience corresponds to what we make conceptualize as God. He is not this, not that. There is a very famous way in theology which is called via negativia, which is the negative way. And the foremost proponent in the Western world is Meister Eckhart, the great mystic, who said that we cannot say anything affirmative about God. We can only say things which are negative about God. Negative in the sense we can say what God is not, but we can never say what God is. This is called via negativia. But via negativia is not agnosticism. It is important to differentiate the two. Via negativia says we can't affirm any positive qualities of God. We cannot say what he is, but we can say what he is not. There are some properties we know he lacks. Via negativia applies the category of negation to God, whereas agnosticism does not. Terry Eagleton, whom students of literature know, he has many interests, and he has also written a book on reason, faith and revolution, reflections on the God debate. Although he's a literary critic, but he's deeply interested in philosophy, and has written this book. And he speaks about the God problem in this book. He mocks the superficiality of the New Age atheists. You know, those New Age atheists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and others. And according to Eagleton, what they do is attack a simplistic straw man version of religion rather than engaging with complex theology. Now, if a Western Marxist critic, Terry Eagleton is a Marxist critic, can see how these new atheists are building a castle in the air, what we can do on our part is at least try and engage with these problems and understand, even if we have to read mostly the material produced by them. Now, at one point in time, mantiq and falsafa were taught in madrasas. They were part of Dars-e-Nizami. But it has completely changed now. Our madrasas now produce people with no understanding of the larger questions of life and philosophy. The result is before our eyes. There is absolutely no connection with the world of ideas, no capacity or readiness to understand the diversity of thought. Most of our religious scholars quarrel over trivial matters. No wonder they excel in intolerance and mutual hatred and whatnot. Because it's a principle that when you grapple with big questions of life, you realize how small-minded those people are who are ever busy in trivial questions, trivial things. You don't necessarily get answers to those questions, but your mind is open to a different type of problems. I'm reminded of Frederick Copleston. Copleston was a very famous figure in the Western world in the 20th century. He was a Jesuit, a professor of philosophy, who is famous for his debate on the existence of God with Bertrand Russell, which was broadcast on BBC in late 1940s. He wrote a book on philosophy, on the history of philosophy, in 10 volumes. And he said that, in the beginning he said that, I think it is very important for Christians, especially Catholics, to read and understand philosophy, because engaging with the great problems of existence and which are part of our tradition is so important that one cannot remain a reflective, thinking, intelligent Christian without engaging those problems. And Catholic Church had a kind of a position on philosophy. They never rejected philosophy, as was the case with the Protestant Revolution later on. And we know that people like Martin Luther and Calvin and other Protestants, we find this culminating in the thought of Kierkegaard, which becomes fideistic more and more. It reaches a point where philosophy and religion are seen as two quite opposed viewpoints. We'll come to this problem of fideism. Fideism is the belief which says that philosophy and religion, they are two completely separate categories with no overlap, and faith has nothing to do with reason. I believe because it is absurd, says Kierkegaard. Iqbal was not a fideist. Now, what is the divine? I will say a few basic things about what is the religious way of looking at the world. The world as we see it is not all. This is the first thing that a religious consciousness is convinced of. There is an invisible order on which this world depends. That order is the very foundation and the reason why there is anything at all. Number two, that suprasensible reality. The suprasensible reality is reality which you cannot grasp with your senses. It has a nature, which is to say that it has a being, an existence independent of everything outside it. There is, of course, a lot of disagreement about what that being is, whether it is ontologically separate from the universe as we see it, or is there basically one being and the universe is not ontologically different from it. Number three, the question, why to posit that there is such an order, that there is such a being at all? From pre-Socratic times down to the present, philosophers have maintained that the visible order requires some explanation for why it exists. It does not explain itself. If you read Plato, you'll find this forcefully argued, that the physical order, the phenomenal world, does not explain itself. It requires some explanation, an explanation from outside, that is. In ancient Greece, Parmenides and Plato are two prime examples of this line of thinking. Plato is the first Western philosopher to have created a system of thought. His basic insight is that there is more to this world than meets the eye, which is intelligible. He draws a distinction between the perceptible and the intelligible. The intelligible is the real, not the perceptible. Reason, if used properly, can offer us some help, according to Plato. Now, is this being or is this order or what philosophers would call the permanent element, is it a person or not? Because this is a central problem in philosophy and also in Iqbal. Is the divine a person? Here again we have a lot of disagreement. Theists believe that it is a person, hence the idea of God. Some philosophers like Spinoza believe that it is not a person. Now let me briefly say something about different philosophical positions, different theological positions, because all of them, these are important to understand what Iqbal has to say, which will come, I will come to after this discussion. What are the main positions when it comes to the divine? Theism. Theism is the most well known. Theism is the belief, sometimes we also call it monotheism, that there is such a being we call God, who is a person with some qualities and attributes. The belief in an unchanging God, these are all the postulates of theism, that there is an unchanging God who is external to the world, external to the phenomenal world, who nevertheless miraculously and supernaturally acts in the world at specific moments in history. God as unique, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, supernatural person who is the creator and sustainer of all that exists. Now I have used these terms, you know these terms, omnipotent, one who is all powerful, omniscient, one who knows everything, omnibenevolent, whose benevolence and mercy encompasses everything, and yet a person. He is the uncreated creator of all things, a being who has many attributes, mainly attributes like justice, love, mercy, power, knowledge. Iqbal will talk about 4 of them, which we'll come to later on. Therefore, God's uncreatedness, his self-sufficiency and independence of everything else, they are stressed in theism. Now, I will come to Islamic theology. It is fairly, elaborate, but I'm skipping some points and portions. I will come to Islamic tradition. Now, with Islamic theology has a history of its own. In the first centuries, people they were busy doing other things, but since humans cannot rest content with something which is given to them, and they cannot shut themselves off from the influences which come from different sources. So we know that during the Abbasid period there was that translation movement where Greek texts and classical works were translated into Arabic. And when Islamic theology rose among Muslims, what was Islamic theology? It was the reflection on the nature of existence, and it was an attempt to interpret the divine scripture from a philosophical point of view. Although we know that there is a big difference between proper Muslim philosophers and theologians. We don't call Mu'tazilis philosophers, we call them a school of Kalam. We don't call Asharis philosophers. We reserve this term for Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina and others, and we know this. But theology does raise all those questions which philosophy of religion raises. Now let us look at this. The first school that comes to mind is theological anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is when you conceive of God in human terms. Anthropo means humans. Anthropomorphism is the tendency to conceive of God in human terms, which is in a way unavoidable, because if you want to say anything about God, you have to use some language and you have to have some analogy. And the best analogy that is available to us is the human person. And in Islamic theology, words like tashbih means similitude, likening God to human beings. The basic principle there is likening God to human beings. When we say that God is merciful, we think of God's mercy in terms of a human person's mercy. In theological language, it is called cataphatic. Cataphatic is thinking in with the help of images, understanding God with images. Kataphatic, cataphatic. And I think in Islam, this theological anthropomorphism reaches its climax in the school of Hanbalis, who rejected all attempts to explain all these verses of the Quran figuratively. Yadullahi fawqa aydihim. So they tended to interpret it more or less literally. Opposed to this is the school that we can call theological apophasis. Apophasis is the opposite of anthropomorphism, or it is the opposite of cataphasis. Apophasis is when you do not use analogies for God. That is, when you stress tanzih. I've used these two terms, tashbih and tanzih. Tashbih was a favorite with Hanbalis, also some Asharis, although it was mitigated tashbih, you can call it. But Mu'tazilas, the first Muslim rational school, they rejected any kind of anthropomorphism as much as they could. So they stressed on dissimilitude, God's not being like anything that humans have. And they stressed, Laisa kamislihi shay. Nothing is like God. So apophasis would mean without images. Then there is the third group, which we can call theological agnosticism. The first would be anthropomorphism, the second would be apophasis of Mu'tazilas, and the third would be theological agnosticism. What is this theological agnosticism? This was prevalent in the Sunni schools, especially of Asharis. Perhaps some might say that it is too much to call Asharis theological agnostics, because they affirmed all the attributes of God mentioned in the Quran. But then they held how these categories, these concepts apply to God is a mystery. God is good and merciful, but not in the way we are, rather in a way entirely different than we can conceive. This in effect borders on agnosticism. The great Fazlur Rahman, whom unfortunately we don't read, but we should read Fazlur Rahman. He's one of the greatest minds that we have produced in recent times, in the last century. One of his books is, a brilliant book is just named Islam. And in Islam he writes about Ghazali. He says that Ghazali affirmed an agnosticism about God's ultimate and absolute nature, and said that God reveals himself to man only insofar as he is related to man, that is through his names and attributes. Although this is a fair description, but we know that Ghazali and other orthodox theologians ultimately uphold a kind of theological voluntarism, where all names and attributes are virtually made subservient to his inscrutable will. You know about this idea of voluntarism? There is a big debate in Islamic philosophy and theology, not only in Islamic but also in the Western world, about when we describe God, how do we describe it, and what gets precedence in God as a person. It's a very long, it's a very complex problem, but let me get to this point. Saying that voluntarism is supreme for Asharis, including Ghazali, means that it's God's will that takes precedence over everything else. Even his mercy, even his goodness, even his justice. Okay? And for the more philosophically oriented among you, it raises the complex question of whether God is limited by anything else, by anything at all or not. Which is to say that if God has a nature, then God is limited by his nature. For example, God cannot tell a lie because it is not part of his nature. So he's limited in that sense that he cannot lie. So he's not all powerful in the absolute sense. This particular stance about theological voluntarism has raised its own issues and problems, which unfortunately I cannot discuss here. Now, this theological agnosticism is not, however, not to be confused with agnosticism as we know it today. Agnosticism, as it is understood now, means we cannot know and therefore not affirm whether God exists or not. In today's parlance or usage, we use agnosticism as a very close term to atheism. Bertrand Russell used to call himself an agnostic. When he was jailed, the jailer asked him, "What religion do you follow?" He said, "I am an agnostic." He said, "That doesn't matter, we believe in the same God. I'm a Christian, you believe in an agnostic God, I believe in a Christian God." So agnosticism means that we cannot affirm anything about God. There is a thin line between an atheist and an agnostic. While an atheist would claim that we can know and demonstrate that the idea of God is not defensible, an agnostic suspends his judgment and practically lives as if there is no God. Abul Hasan Ashari, said about this about God's attributes. He used the term bila kaifa, without asking how. And there is a very famous quote which is ascribed to Imam Malik about istiwa. Summa stawa ala al-arsh. Then he raised himself on the throne. Al-istiwa'u ma'loom wa kayfiyatuhu majhul wa su'alu anhu bid'ah. And what is the third thing? Yes. Wal imanu bihi wajib. That we know istiwa. Istiwa is when God says in the Quran that he sat on the throne. Summa stawa ala al-arsh. Literally it means he sat on the throne. What does it mean for God to sit on his throne? Does God sit just like we sit on our chairs? And then there was that very popular story about Ibn Taymiyyah giving a sermon on the pulpit of the Grand Mosque in Damascus, and someone asked him about istiwa. He said, "Ha kaza," that he was sitting on step 1. He stood up and sat on the step 2. He said, "Ha kaza." But then it was not true, because people who had actually said this about it was not proved that they had seen or they were present there when Ibn Taymiyyah would have said this. So Imam Malik would say that we know istiwa, we know God sitting, but we cannot ask how. And if you ask how, then it would be bid'ah. But it is important to believe in it, because iman bihi wajib. This reminds me of Abul Kalam Azad. As students of Urdu, you should must have already read him. In Gubar-e-Khatir there is a letter where Abul Kalam Azad talks about the dilemma of believing in an unseen, unseeable God, invisible God. And he says that what is the reason that people throughout centuries in all cultures have tried to imagine God in some form? And he says that people want something concrete, something visible. Belief in an unseen God is so difficult. Abul Kalam Azad, in one of his letters in Gubar-e-Khatir, talks of this dilemma, which is typical of those who believe in an absolutely transcendental God who cannot be conceived in any way and whose image cannot be formed, cannot be made. Have you imagined that, have you ever thought that when we grow up as children, when our parents tell us that there is a God, what image of God comes to our mind? A small child, his image of God as an all-powerful, all-knowing hard taskmaster sitting above, perhaps with a stick in his hand. perhaps like a domineering grandfather or a father. A more subtle, refined image of God would be, as Matthew Arnold put it, a non-natural magnified man. I have a quote by Hakim Murad, Abdul Hakim Murad, who I think puts it very beautifully. This is in his book Commentary on the 11th Contentions. He says that theology is the quest for the least silly definition of God. Theology is the search, is the quest for the least silly definition of God. Okay, so this was about theism. Let us come to pantheism. Pantheism holds that the universe and God, they are identical. They believe that God and the world constitute one reality, essentially indistinguishable from one another, which means that there is no transcendental God, all is immanent. Pantheism implies that there is no personal and transcendental God. Spinoza comes to mind as the most important upholder, champion of this idea, who believed that this universe and God are one and the same thing. This is the reason that he was condemned both as an atheist by his own Jewish community, because his God was not the transcendental God of the Old Testament. God for Spinoza is the singular infinite substance outside which there is nothing. This constitutes the whole of reality. God is the fundamental harmony and order of the universe. And therefore not all conceptions of the divine are theistic. That is the point. There is another term, and this one is important. It's called panentheism. Panentheism, if pantheism means all is God, panentheism means all is in God, although God is not limited to all that we can see. All is in God. Why is this term important? Because some people have used this for Iqbal. They said that Iqbal was a panentheist, and I think there is an element of truth in this description. I will try to explain what that is. God includes but also transcends the world. This is what panentheism means. God includes but also transcends the world. If you think that panentheism is so heterodox and so un-Islamic, please remember that Sayyid Hussain Nasr, the great Islamic philosopher, perhaps the greatest Islamic philosopher that is living today, when he is asked to describe which term comes closest to the Sufi doctrine of reality, he says panentheism. Panentheism, according to Sayyid Hussain Nasr, is the nearest description to explaining Wahdatul Wujud, for example, the great system of Ibn Arabi. R.A. Nicholson, who was a translator of Iqbal and also his friend, he puts the difference between pantheism and panentheism in this way. He says that all is God is pantheism. All is in God, who is above all, is panentheism. Okay. Another way of saying this is, the universe is in God, yet God is more than the universe. Panentheism affirms that God is present in all things, and conversely, that all things are present in God. God is more than the world, but also intimately in touch with all things, shaping and being shaped by each moment of experience. And I'm reminded of two people who have used this term for Iqbal: Salman Rashid in his book on Iqbal's concept of God, and Robert Whitmore, who wrote an article which was published in the Review of Metaphysics. That article is titled Iqbal's Panentheism. Then there is what we call deism, but we will not go into deism because deism is a bit removed from us. Deism is the view that became popular in 18th century Europe. The idea that in Aristotle, when he talks about God, for Aristotle God is the prime mover, one who set the clock going but has nothing to do with the world now. No, deist is a person who thinks that there is a God who created the world, but God has since detached himself from the world. He is not concerned with the affairs of the world anymore. This is important for Aristotle. It was important for his description of thought, thinking thought. One of the reasons that Aristotle thought so was that God cannot be conceived of thinking about things of this world, because that would imply some kind of deficiency in God. It became popular in 18th century after Enlightenment, with some help from science, and some scientists, they also were deists. Anyway, I skip this. This is important to keep in mind when all this information is important when we read Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, because all these ideas come up. Iqbal uses the word pantheism many times in Reconstruction, and he is trying hard to make a case against pantheism. We'll come to that. So I'm skipping some part of it, which is the background. Coming back to Iqbal. Iqbal agrees with the mainstream Islamic tradition, according to which we can affirm something about God. That God is, that he is a person, in the sense that he is a nature with some attributes, enshrined in Al-Asma'ul Husna, that is God's beautiful names. Iqbal thought that reason cannot be kept away from religion, otherwise it will become a blind imitation that Quran condemns. The Quran is perhaps the only revealed scripture that emphasizes using intellect time and again, and Iqbal was convinced that religious faith cannot be put inside a wall where no rational scrutiny can reach. In fact, he quotes A.N. Whitehead, the great mathematician and physicist, and the founder of process theology. He quotes it in the very first lecture, where he says, this is a quote from Whitehead, who says that the ages of faith have been the ages of reason. Iqbal therefore is not a fideist. Fideism is a philosophical position which says that faith and reason have nothing to do with each other. Broadly speaking, Iqbal thinks that revelation, reason, and mystical experience all play their role in giving us some knowledge of God. Ghazali, for Iqbal, is a philosophical skeptic who thinks reason has little role in the experience of God or divine. Iqbal, in the very first lecture, shows his dissatisfaction with Ghazalian skepticism. When Iqbal went to Europe, the spell of Hegelianism was still powerful. He joined Cambridge University and studied under John McTaggart. John McTaggart was an idealist, a teacher of Iqbal, but John McTaggart was also an atheist. Iqbal wrote a brief piece on his death, in which he mentions how he used to McTaggart almost every day, and their discussions would center on God. And Iqbal writes, his powerful logic would always silence me, but never convince me. Dr. Javed Iqbal, in one of his essays, writes that Iqbal was more of a pantheist when he went to Europe, and it was during his stay there that he turned averse to it. And McTaggart also says, in a letter written by McTaggart to Iqbal in 1920, when McTaggart had read R.A. Nicholson's translation of Asrar-e-Khudi, this is what he wrote to Iqbal: have you not changed your position very much? Surely in the days when we used to talk philosophy together, you were much more of a pantheist and a mystic. And we know that Asrar-e-Khudi is a strong rejection of pantheism. And this is another important thing in Iqbal, that Iqbal thinks that pantheism is the form of tasawwuf which was largely responsible for the inertia and inaction that had gripped the Islamic world. He called it Ajmi tasawwuf, with its focus on the inner world, withdrawal of interest from the world, which was, according to him, an exact antithesis of Islam's spiritual but powerful message of turning outward from the inner. In tasawwuf, we have the idea of taskhir-e-nafs, subduing the self, but not taskhir-e-fitrat, subduing the nature, which seems to be the goal in Iqbal. And in fact, Iqbal saw Islam compatible with the modern scientific spirit. He is critical of the classical spirit, the ancient classical spirit. The Quranic spirit he calls anti-classical because it invites us to ponder on nature. The Quran finds in the honeybee, there's a famous quote in Reconstruction, that Quran finds in the honeybee a God's sign. That is, it invites us to look outside ourselves like modern science does. Socrates and Plato and other people and mystics who talk about turning within, they miss this point. Now, as far as influences on Iqbal's concept of the divine are concerned, we can identify a few of them. There is Quran with its emphasis on the God of transcendence. There is speculative Sufism. Despite Iqbal's protestations against Sufism, he was very much influenced by the Sufi thought. And the third influence is modern Western philosophies. Now let us briefly talk about, we'll take 15 minutes more, 15 minutes more. Let us talk about, in lecture 2 and lecture 3 of Reconstruction. Lecture 2 of Reconstruction is on the philosophical test of religious experience. And he begins with those traditional proofs for the existence of God, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument. And he very clearly says that these arguments do not work. These arguments do not work for the existence of God. Since we don't have time to unpack what Iqbal thinks, why they don't work, so I will skip that. But for those of you who are interested, you just go through those first few pages of this lecture, and you will know why Iqbal thinks that these arguments for the existence of God do not work. I will now say something about where I think that Iqbal departs from traditional theism about God, from classical theism. We will see that he is trying hard to bring together different, and some would say even mutually incongruent strands together to arrive at a concept of the divine. I see Iqbal as a monotheist leaning towards panentheism, much like the speculative mysticism he tried to refute on some other grounds. He shows he has a Catholic imagination which assimilates a range of ideas from the East and the West. His attempt is to create a synthesis, drawing all the help possible from the Quran, Western thought and science. First and foremost, Iqbal is a great believer in the self, person. God for him is a free and creative will, a person, the ultimate, absolute or infinite ego, not merely an impersonal force. He calls nature God's habit. To study nature through science is to discover God's habits or ways. Hence, at a place in Reconstruction, he will say that a scientist who studies nature is like a worshipper who worships God, because both are engaged in basically a similar kind of activity. Iqbal rejects naturalism or scientific naturalism, which insists on the autonomy of nature and physical laws and holds nature to be purposeless. Now, this concept of self is so important to Iqbal, as we know that he is famous for this concept of khudi. And this is so important for Iqbal that he thinks that the ultimate reality of this universe is this khudi, is this self. Khudi ki khilwaton mein Mustafai, khudi ki jalwaton mein kibriyai, zameen-o asmaan-o kurshi-o arsh, khudi ki zad mein hai sari khudai. Now, if we ponder over the last part, khudi ki zad mein hai sari khudai, we can understand how the idea of self precedes everything for Iqbal. Agar khahi khuda ra fash bini, khudi ra fash tar didan biyamuz. If you want to see God clearly, first learn to see your khudi more clearly, with a clearer eye. The ultimate ego for him is an individual. To emphasize his individuality, the Quran uses the proper name of Allah. And when Iqbal talks about the meaning of prayer, prayer can only make sense if there is some kind of relationship between the human self and the divine self. Iqbal interprets Hallaj's Anal Haq in an ingenious way. You know the history of Anal Haq, it has its own history. And Louis Massenon spent 50 years reading Hallaj's thought and then wrote that book, The Passion of Hallaj, and which is one of the fascinating works done on any mystic. He calls it the creative eye and asserts that the closer one approaches God, the more perfect one's individuality becomes. And as he puts it, in the higher Sufism, it's a quote in Reconstruction, in the higher Sufism of Islam, unitive experience is not the finite ego effacing its identity, but some sort of absorption into the infinite ego. It is rather the infinite passing into the loving embrace of the finite. Now, people have written about this, that when Mansur Hallaj said Anal Haq, and the reason, and we know that the history after that, he was executed because he was charged with blasphemy. He was not saying I am God. He was actually, according to Iqbal, this, what does this symbolize? He is saying that it was the infinite coming into the loving embrace of the finite. That was Mansur's Anal Haq. रकाबत इल्म इरफा में गलत बीनी है मिंबर की कि वो हल्लाज की सूली को समझा है रकीब अपना. Mimbar is a symbol for exoteric religion, the theologian, who thinks that knowledge and gnosis are mutually antithetical. But it is galat bini hai mimbar ki, rakabat ilm irfan ki galat bini hai mimbar ki. They are not antithetical, says Iqbal. Mansur's declaration symbolizes not the human ego getting absorbed into the divine, but the infinite allowing itself to pass into the loving embrace of the finite. Man does not become God or realize that he is part of the divine. The two are locked in an embrace, and the finite attains the highest goal in asserting itself. Ana, or the self, is the highest truth. Individuality for Iqbal is also a matter of degrees, and the absolute ego is the most unique individual. And this is the reason when he interprets Qul hu Allahu ahad Allahu samad, he says that this is actually a proclamation that the highest self cannot reproduce itself, because that will work against the principle of self itself. The self needs to be unique, and the self cannot reproduce itself. So Qul hu Allahu ahad lam yalid, he cannot beget and he cannot be begotten, because it is the unique self. Then we also know that Iqbal talks about 4 main attributes of God. He talks about his creativity, his knowledge, his omnipotence, and his eternity. These are the 4 things that Iqbal talks of when he talks about God's attributes. Now, there are some important things that I want to share. Unfortunately, I don't have time, but I will just tell you the most important things. Creativity is the first attribute that Iqbal talks of in God. This creativity is not something that is done with once and for all. It is something that keeps on happening. It is a continuous process. Creativity is God's continuous process. Yazidu fi khalqihi ma yasha. You know, there's another charge against Iqbal, that he picks up Quranic verses wherever he likes and fits them into his system. But I think all thinkers do that. The idea of reading the Quran as it is, without any prejudice, without any bias, without any position whatsoever, I think needs a very serious self-introspection. So yes, Iqbal does. He picks up verses from the Quran and fits them wherever he thinks that they are useful. Now, I was when he talks about destiny, taqdeer, and he calls it an open set of probabilities, and he says that this is one of the worst things that has happened to the Muslim civilization, that taqdeer has been thought of as something already fixed, future already fixed. And he says that this is an open set of probabilities that also has a bearing on his concept of what God is and what his knowledge of the future is. Future for Iqbal is not something which is already fixed. Future is something that is in the making, always in the making, not something already fixed. I was reminded that he somehow is not reminded of Gulibatir Rum fi adnal ardi wa hum min ba'di ghalabihim sayaglibun fi biz'i sinin. How would Iqbal respond to that? Anyway, the divine is not static. The divine is not a static being, according to Iqbal. It is a dynamic will. He does not think that change is always a mark of imperfection. Okay, so if we can think of divine as something, as a being that changes or grows, it is not always a mark of imperfection. Since the divine is the whole of reality, as he says, the not yet of God means unfailing. This is a reconstruction. The not yet of God means unfailing realization of the infinite creative possibilities of his being, which retains its wholeness throughout the entire process. Now you see, this is linked to another problem that I just mentioned. What was Iqbal's view of Wahdatul Wujud? We know that he was critical of Wahdatul Wujud. He makes it clear at many places. In one of his letters, he says that मुझे इब्ने अरबी की फुसूसुल हिकम में बगैर ज़ंदका के कुछ नहीं मिला. This is the harshest that you can go. बगैर ज़ंदका के मुझे कुछ नहीं मिला. And he was a great admirer of Sheikh Ahmad Sarhindi, and he was a great critic of Ajmi Tasawwuf and all that. And the reason that he did not like Plato, because Rahib Derina Aflatun Hakim Az Girohe Gosfandane Kadim, he belongs to the old tribe, tribe of sheep, have nothing to do with Al Hazar as Gosfanda Al Hazar. I think that the reason that Iqbal opposed this was he thought that the concept of the self that they have is something that he cannot accept, because if the only real is only the one, that means that the human selves are unreal. But Iqbal insists that the human selves are real, and they have been created by the divine self. So Iqbal opposed tasawwuf because of the idea of the self as unreal in it. He saw a fundamental similarity between tasawwuf and some ancient Indian schools like that of Shankara. If you read the preface of Asrar-e Khudi, he will talk about Shankara, he will talk about Ramanuja, and he will disagree with Shankara because there is monism. Ultimately, the human selves and the reality is reduced to Maya in Shankara's system, which he disagrees with. But more importantly, Iqbal believed that the widespread and deep influence of tasawwuf had practically incapacitated Muslims, making them fatalists, leading to their decadence. And this is also the reason that he opposed the concept of taqdeer. When Iqbal says that God is an all-inclusive ego, he is not saying something very different from what Wujudi Sufis have always said. Again, when he says, and these are important lines in Reconstruction, that there is no other to God. Now this is the classical picture in classical theism. God and the universe are ontologically distinct, and therefore there is no way to avoid the conclusion that the universe is the other of the God. But Iqbal makes it very categoric that universe does not confront God as an other. It is when he defines the relation between the infinite and the finite egos, that Iqbal parts company with Theosophical Sufism. So my point is that when it comes to one reality, Iqbal saying that the universe, God does not confront the universe as the other, brings him very close to those monists who believe that reality is one, as against those classical theists who would subscribe to the idea that God and the world, they basically are two distinct entities. For Iqbal, the infinite self does not assimilate the finite selves, so that the latter lose their individuality. This is his problem with Sufism, because in Sufism, in Wujudi Sufism, the human self ultimately has to be absorbed in that larger infinite self. But Iqbal maintains that although the divine is an ego and he is an all-inclusive ego, but somehow all those egos also, that is the human egos, they also are able to retain their individuality. They don't get absorbed in the divine. Okay, so this is, I think, the basic idea in Iqbal's problem with Sufism. Time is real for Iqbal. 10 more minutes, Altaf Sahab. Time is real. Time is not unreal. This is again a classical problem in theology. How is God related to time? You know about the joke that one person came to St. Augustine and said that, what was God doing before he created this world? He was creating hell for you. For people who ask such questions. For Augustine and also Boethius, and the inspiration comes from Plato, God is timeless. He is outside time. And this is more or less the picture that was passed on to classical theism, that God is outside time. Iqbal makes a modification to this. He says that there are actually two times. There is pure time, which he calls pure duration, and then there is serial time. For humans, all that is the serial time. But God lives in pure time. God is not outside time. Why does he say so? There is a reason why. Because he thinks that it will reduce God. If we think of God as something which is outside time, it will reduce God to a static entity. And then philosophically it will be difficult to explain his immanence, his relationship with the universe. Ujibu da'wat da'iza da'ani falyastajibu li wal yu'minu bi la'allahum yarshudun. Wa iza sa'alaka ibadi anni fa inni qareeb. I am near and I hear and I answer. Okay, all that. And this silsila rozo shab is not something which is unreal, it is real. Silsila rozo shab naksh gare hadisat, silsila rozo shab asle hayato mamat, सिलसिला रोज़ शब तारे हरीरे दो रंग जिससे बनाती है ज़ात अपनी क़बाए सिफ़ात. तुझको परखता है ये, मुझको परखता है ये, सिलसिले रोज़ शब सैर फ़ी कायनात. And as I said, that he believes that the process is ongoing. ये कायनात अभी ना तमाम है शायद कि आ रही है दमादम सदाए कुन फ़यकून. So this kun fayakun is not something that was said once and it has ended there. It continues. The reader of Reconstruction of Religious Thought finds it hard to believe that Iqbal actually thinks that the universe is distinct from God. And this is what gives credence to those people who think that Iqbal was a panentheist. I would still qualify it, I would say that he was still a theist but had leanings towards panentheism. It is, the universe is God's act of creation, it is an expression of his creativity. And when he criticizes that cosmological argument and teleological argument, he says that why would God create intractable material first and then use his wisdom to press it, to harness it into his some kind of service, to press it into his service? Why would God do that? This is slightly more philosophical because it goes back to the ancient philosophers, that whether God created the world ex nihilo or whether he created it from something. No? Philosophers who think that God created world from not ex nihilo, they find it easier to grapple with the problem of evil, because then somehow they say that evil is not a creation of God, it is an inevitable and necessary condition of matter itself. But this is slightly more philosophical, so I will not go into this. Okay, so he does not believe in fixity and stasis, he believes in change. He believes, in other words, in a God who is not averse to change. About the second attribute, omniscience. Omniscience again is not a passive omniscience, and the future, as we know, is not fixed according to Iqbal. God's freedom and there is nothing that can impede God's creativity, so on and so forth. When he comes to omnipotence, this was something that I wanted to talk about, but I don't have much time, so I will say it as quickly as possible. When it comes to omnipotence, Iqbal talks about, one important attribute in all theologies is God's goodness. And it is believed that God is infinitely good, supremely good being. But then immediately problems arise that if God is a supremely good being, why is this world imperfect? Hasile kun hai ye kainat. यही मुमकिन था ऐसी उजलत में. This is not Iqbal, this is John Elia. The idea that if God is himself perfect, why did he create an imperfect world? Why did he create an imperfect universe? And theology grapples with this question. Now, traditionally, Islamic theology has also grappled with this question as a subsidiary, not in its own right. Please remember this, not in its own right in Mu'tazilis, in Asharis, in Maturidis, but as a subsidiary problem of God's omnipotence. And Iqbal follows that if God is all powerful, why is there Satan? Why is there evil? And great minds think alike, and great minds engage with these problems in similar way. Iqbal talks so much about Satan, Shaitan, Iblis, Muhawara, Idhar Udhar, and in Payam-e-Mashriq, in Jbal-e Jibril. There are so many poems on, and ultimately for Iqbal, Iblis plays a positive role in divine scheme. So there is no such thing as absolute evil. He does not say it, but he seems to be subscribing to the Platonic and Augustine view that evil does not have an existence of its own. It is privatio boni. It is just the absence of good. Evil is simply the absence of good. Anyway, when he talks about omnipotence, he talks about God's goodness, then he talks in detail about the fall of Adam, the creation of man. Go back and read those pages in this lecture, and you will find how much he talks about this fall of man and how did it all start and what was the end. Now, I will come to this part. This is again something that I don't know of anyone who has said this before, but Iqbal says this, that since the universe has the scope for improvement, it is an imperfect universe, it is moving towards or can potentially move towards perfection if God is helped by man. If God is helped by man. I don't think anybody else has said this before Iqbal among Muslim philosophers. So this is the status of man in Iqbal, that man is not simply a being who is created and thrown into this world and he has to pass certain moral tests and that is it. These are some of the verses that are mind-boggling for me. We know about that general idea, baad mukhalif se na ghabra aqab, ye to udti hai tujhe own. That sums up the basic idea, that if something confronts you, the reason that it confronts you is only to take you higher. But look at these verses of Payam-e-Mashriq. Nawai ishq ra sazast Adam, गुशायद राज व खुद राजस्त आदम जहां ऊ आफरीद इन खूब तर साख्त मगर बा ईज़द अंबाज़स्त आदम. Now what does this mean? Look, the second verse. Jahan u afri, that is, God created the universe in khub tar sakht, and man made it better. Magar ba izad ambazast Adam. That means that man is a co-partner of God. Man participates in God's act of creating perfection. No one has said this before in my knowledge, maybe there are. And look at this muhavara baina khuda wa insan in Payam Mashriq. Tu shab afridi, charag afridam, sifal afridi, ayag afridam. You created night, I defeated it by creating light. So God was bent on creating, darkness, because that was the part of his scheme. But I changed it. I created light. I created chirag. And look at these verses of Zabur Ajam. Baz in alame derina jawami bayist. Barge kahash sifate koh girami bayist. In maho mehr kohan rah bajayi nabarand. Anjume taz batamir jahan mi bayist. हर निगारी की मारा पेश नजर मी आयद खुश निगारी वली खुश तरजा मी बाइस्त. This is the last line, the punch line. Guft yazdan ki chunin has digar hich magu. When God created the universe, he said to man, this is the universe that I have created. Ask for nothing more. Guft yazdan ki chunin hast digar hich magu. This is the world that I have created, ask no more. Guft Adam ki chunin hast tu chunan mi baist. But man said, I know it is this, but it should not have been like this. It should have been like that. That is, it should have been according to what I wanted, not according to what you want. Because you have made it the world, and you have put me in this world. And not for nothing that he says that Guftan jahane ma aya batumi sazad, Guftam nami sazad, Guftan barham zan. They asked me, when they created this universe, they asked me, is it according to what you want? Isse hum ahang ho. Is it okay for you? I said no. What did God say? Destroy it, create a new one. Destroy the world that I have created, create a new world. What does this show? That Iqbal is projecting man in a way which is, that's why people say that this is humanistic Iqbal, the influence of Übermensch, of Nietzsche and all that. But it is basically about how Iqbal sees, and I think this has great implications, how Iqbal sees the role of man in universe in creating his own destiny. There is a flip side to it also, but maybe we have time some other day, we will talk about it. Now to the conclusion. A few important points. Iqbal is not a natural theologian. He does not think we can know whatever needs to be known about God by means of reason, unaided by revelation. That, however, does not make him a pure theologian like Ghazali, one who distrusts reason radically when it comes to conceptualizing God. If that were the case, Reconstruction would not have been written at all. Iqbal, therefore, is not a fideist and does not advocate a separation of reason and faith. Although Iqbal would have agreed that reason is subordinate to revelation, his entire corpus reveals that engagement with revelation is a hermeneutical exercise requiring exercise of reason. There is no such thing as a religion without reason or outside reason. Iqbal was a monotheist with leanings towards panentheism. By creating other egos, God had limited himself in some sense. The universe is not a fact or an event which has already reached its perfection. God is actively seeking man's participation in making this universe better every moment. Jahan u afreed in khub tar sakht. Magar ba'izad ambazast Adam. God created the universe, and man makes it even better. So man is God's partner. In fact, Iqbal's God gives man the right to turn his world upside down and create a new world order. Guftan jahane ma aya batumi sazad, guftam nami sazad, guftan barham zan. Thank you.